Good afternoon. Welcome to our session on the Yellow Book. I hope you all had a very nice lunch break. I was able to catch some clips of the Blue Horizon during lunch break. What a fascinating journey. Now, getting back to it, this is the session on the Yellow Book and the pandemic. We have a very informative session planned for you. My name is Asif Khan. I'm a director at GAO. This is a moderated panel discussion with question and answers. We had prepared the questions and answers in advance just to make sure that we covered all the areas. The panel discussions will include audit considerations during the pandemic, a discussion about CPE, the peer review extension and audit risks, and how audit organizations are addressing such risks. You're encouraged to answer the polling questions. It helps us gauge who is in the audience. Having said that, let's go to our first polling question. Please go to the left-hand side of your screen and select a response. We will give you about 30 seconds to see who is in the audience. Okay, it's getting filled up. Looks like oh, interesting. Looks like most of the participants this afternoon are with our state auditors, followed by federal inspector generals, then followed by auditors from Supreme Audit Institutes, and then there are some other GAGAS users further down. But looks like the majority are from the federal inspector generals, followed by state auditors, followed by audit from the Supreme Audit Institutions, such as the GAO. Thank you, Jerome. Just to provide you some context for this session, the audit community, just like everyone else, was impacted by the pandemic. The GAO issued alerts for information purposes to the practitioners. These alerts relate to audits of new government programs arising from the pandemic, as well as ongoing audits. With this, let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Jim Dalkin. Jim is a director in the financial management and assurance team at GAO. Jim should be no stranger to you all. He's responsible for GAO's work in the accounting and auditing profession, including GAO's government auditing standards and standards for internal controls in the federal government. Next, we have Brett Baker. Brett is the Assistant Inspector General for Audit, Office of the Inspector General at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Then last but not least, we have George Strudgeon. He is the Audit Director at the Virginia Auditor of Public Accounts. He specializes in compliance assurance for his team and coordinates the single audit for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you all for serving on this panel this afternoon. With this, we will go to our second polling question. What were your top 3 audit concerns created by the pandemic? We will give you about 45 seconds to respond to this. Looks like the polls are coming in. Okay, this looks like pretty equal. Well, actually, it's assessing fraud risks, assessing internal controls seems to be the 2 major items. Assessing internal controls being the biggest, then followed by audit evidence, audit documentation, quality control and peer review, and then by ethics, independence, and professional judgment. Very good, Jerome. Thank you very much. Thank you for participating in those 2 polls. It's important information for us. With this, we will move into the question and answers session of this panel. We have 7 topics. For each topic, I will begin with Jim to kick off the discussion, and then I will go to Brett and George to add their perspectives. I think, Jerome, we can get rid of the slides. Thank you. The first topic is CPE. The Yellow Book requires training that qualifies as CPE. How did your organization pivot to provide training during the pandemic, and do you plan to continue the practice? Jim, going to you first.
Thanks, Asif. And we always do consider the CPE requirements. Certainly under COVID, it was a significant issue. In fact, the GAO issued in February 29, 2020, a alert which provided for two things. One, it provided for a grace period, and that allowed people to carry their CPE for up to 6 months after the 2-year reporting period. So it was for reporting periods that ended December 31st, 2020, and you were allowed to carry forward, to have a grace period for up to 6 months after that, which would be June 30th, 2021. So that period's actually expired, but it is something to be aware of because you may have individuals at your audit organization that fell into this grace period. The second thing we did was we allowed for a carry forward. And so for those that were able to do, in essence, extra CPE, we allow that to be carried forward as well up to 40 hours. And so that is a 6-month carry forward as well. But I just wanted to highlight those two because I think that was unique under the COVID environment. Thanks, Asif.
Great, thank you. Moving to you, Brett. Can you share your experiences?
Yeah, I think during the early part of COVID, just even before that, we did a lot of in-person training. I think there's some benefit to that, professional development, networking with folks. And then when pandemic came upon us, we moved into 100% online training type of events. This type of training was actually big last year for a lot of shops, and then really anything that's online now. It ended up being almost everything that we were doing. We didn't do anything in person. We did things internally within our shops using the remote technologies that we have at our avail, much like these platforms, but more inside our agencies. And then I think that was important, just getting to what Jim said about, we did get some relief in some fashion, but at least in my shop, we were able to stay pretty much on target, but knowing that we had some relief if we needed it. But the remote technology actually helped, and the remote training actually helped us tremendously. We also found that in many cases, if you take in-person training, you're traveling to the training. In some cases, it's actually it's less costly. And I think the quality of the training was actually very good that we were able to do. But we transitioned in that. I think we'd used remote technologies in the past, but I think we ended up moving into that almost 100%. And I think we had to do that to just maintain our professionalism, make sure we're doing the work that we need to.
Great. George, do you?
Yeah, like Brett's organization, we had to transition to remote training. And, at first it was the big classroom, but kind of setting like what we're doing today. And one of the functionalities that came out in the platform we used was breakout rooms. And so in the past, in a physical world, we would have roundtable discussions where they would have the topic facilitated. And then one of the individuals from that group would then present to the larger group. And so it was probably a couple months into it, we recognized that feature was available in the platform we were using. And so we were able to use breakout rooms and have that same intimate setting within a larger environment or individuals in the room. And able to deploy it. The other thing that we've kind of picked up on it is video. And, we used to be 100% in person with our training, but now that we do our trainings virtual, we're able to record them and then individuals can plan back later who maybe attended the training and just kind of want to recap, or individuals that maybe couldn't attend could watch it and get the benefit of it without necessarily, we haven't figured out a way for it to award CPE in a playback scenario, but maybe that's in the future and something to happen. So those are the kind of two things when we transitioned to the virtual training that we felt have paid off. The smaller breakout rooms, using those, and then the recording of the sessions.
Oh, that's very interesting, George and Brett and Jim. I was thinking about, even going back maybe 5 years ago, a lot of things that we can do now as far as training is concerned really weren't possible. I remember, the most one could do remotely was through telephones. just dialing in. Obviously, you could, watch videos, but real time, there weren't that many options. So, we have come a long way as, given the capabilities technology has provided. Now, just for, the second part of this question, do you see any of the new ways of delivering training or receiving training continuing post-pandemic? Brett, you had mentioned about ease of accessing training. You don't have travel. George, you mentioned high quality. So any of these things, do you envisage them continuing even after the pandemic is over?
Yeah, everything that we just talked about, and George was just spot on in terms of things that they're paying attention to in his area. That we'll see. I think if we could use the term hybrid, we're going to see in person and we're going to see remote more so than we did in the past. And just like you mentioned, Asif, like years ago, it doesn't seem like that many years ago. It was almost always in person. But we're seeing benefit that I think in a lot of ways the training environments are very comparable in some ways, and in some ways even better in some aspects. That not just the travel aspect of it, but I think the technology that goes with it. I think we're going to do more of that.
Great.
Equal.
Right. Anything from you, Jim, on the training perspective? What your team may have done, or is it very much similar to what Brett and George have mentioned?
I think from a Yellow Book perspective, we had provided some flexibility in terms of the nature of the training and the duration. So I think it suits fairly well into the new technologies and ability to deliver the training. And so certainly I expect we're going to see a lot more of the online component, particularly for some of the standardized areas.
Great. Okay. No, that's very useful to understand that. Very good. Moving to the second topic, and that deals with supervision. The Yellow Book requires auditors must properly supervise audit staff. How did you properly supervise audit staff if you could not be there in the same office as they were? Any thoughts on that, Jim, from the standard setting perspective?
Yes, actually, we issued an alert, and that alert was issued in August of 2020. Within that alert, it had a number of general audit areas. We're going to cover quite a few of them today, but one of them, it didn't deal directly with supervision, but it talked about supervision from two perspectives. One from a quality control perspective, and that's the audit organization. How did the audit organization get its hands around staff that were primarily online in many respects? And then secondly, at the engagement level, how would the direct supervisor be able to engage and meet the requirements of supervision? Because that is one of the requirements within the standards, and a very important one, because in a way that's how we train our people, not only through supervision and learning on the job experience. So supervision is very key. So that we did highlight in our alert.
Okay, great, thanks. Brett, to you.
Yeah. So when we started moving into pandemic, we were using electronic tools. We've been using electronic tools for years. So electronic work papers, in that regard. The technology we're using more, though, is the remote technology, the video conferencing, much like this technology. And then, but using technologies was not new to us, but we had to rely on it even more so. And I think the alerts helped us all pay attention to that with the just the right focus and the lens. But we had not, but it wasn't new to us. It's just an adjustment, I think. And then, because we've been digital for a very long time, the electronic work papers, they have things built into them so you can have a sense of the work being done. Timely, you can quickly go in using different linking technologies and these tools to be able to tell whether or not the support was there for any of the assertions that we're making in the reports. We've already had that, and I think combining that with the electronic, the more video technologies actually helped us get a sense how the staff is doing the work. We're interacting with them even more so, and I think all of us have experienced this. So pre-pandemic, we certainly have our calendars and our email system, and then it's lots of meetings during the week. I will tell you, and I just from folks I've talked to, the calendars are just booked now. We're just constantly interacting with our staff, and it's usually with the video cameras on. I think that's important. It gives us a sense. Are they struggling with maybe some things? They need some help in other ways. I think we're watching it closer in some fashion. We are definitely communicating more. And then that goes to what Jim mentioned right at the beginning, just in terms of we've got to be engaged with the staff. I think in many ways we're more engaged.
Makes sense. George, any differences in how you've handled supervision in your?
I agree 100% with Brett. I think our connection points from a supervisory level down to the staff is happening more often. But one of the things I've kind of recognized is the discussions are being more mentoring and can provide feedback during those meetings. And a lot of the meetings happen impromptu. It's just one of the ways I operate. One of my staff will message me and will say, George, are you available? And if I don't have anything on my plate, right then and there, they're getting a call right there through a video link. And then we can have a discussion about whatever the issue is. So it's that immediate access. Just like if we were back in the office and they just, swung by my door and said, George, you got time? Well, yeah, come on in, let's talk about it. But what's also interesting, and just it happens by circumstance, being in a government office, I don't have a physical office. I do have a cubicle walls, but there's a lot of ability for people to overhear conversations. So what I've found is, like, for example, I'm presenting to you all today, but no one else is home with me except for my dog. So if I want to have an honest conversation with you or one of my staff coming to talk to me and provide that immediate feedback, I don't have to worry about the sensitivity of the conversation, because most likely I'm home alone talking to my staff and they're on the other end also home alone. And we're at the office, there would always be that barrier of, well, can somebody hear us? And if not, well, okay, well, let's go move to a private location. And like most offices, people can see you walking down the hall and they're like, oh, well, what's going on? Well, here, you can have those frank conversations, I would think, more open and honestly and more timely than what would traditionally occur in the office. So I think supervision and that feedback to staff, and like Brett said, being able to go right into the electronic work papers, see what the timestamps are, see when people are working, when are they getting stuff done, and being able to review it in nearly real time. But granted, if your calendar's not booked and you have the time, is still being able to be performed.
Right. So that's an option.
Hey, I was going to jump in real quick on what George just mentioned. I think really what it's highlighting is that there's different ways to do our work in supervised staff. There's different technologies, the face-to-face, certainly that's been helpful in the past. I think moving forward, we're going to do it in all ways. So we'll still use face-to-face. I think, George, you mentioned that is helpful. You got to pay attention to how you do it. But I think we have different ways of doing that. Now we're going to be remote to remote. Maybe in some cases we'll be in the office, but and maybe in the office and remote. We have different ways to connect now. That I think it's going to make us better.
Great. Okay. Jim, do you have anything to add on supervision from what you're seeing on your audits?
I do think it highlights the importance of regular check-ins at the team level. And I think if that's done, a lot of the information that would be communicated informally could come up and be part of the discussion and would help mitigate some of the risk.
Right. Okay, thank you. Moving to topic 3, and that's on evidence. The Yellow Book requires the auditor to obtain evidence that's both sufficient and appropriate. Did your audit teams have any creative solutions? And is it likely any of the new approaches will remain after the pandemic is over? What a great question. Jim, over to you first.
Well, we actually covered that in our alert, and it is the issue, how do you obtain that sufficient appropriate evidence? And there's a number of situations where you may have difficulty assessing records, you may have difficulty assessing personnel, you may have a difficulty observing, and there may be restrictions on travel or restrictions for sensitive information. So we recognized all those factors when we crafted the alert, and we said, well, you really have to step back and think, are there alternative procedures that would be sufficient enough to gain that appropriate evidence? And I think a number of auditors thought of some very unique ways of doing walkthroughs via the cameras, and really, I think it's changed the way some of the audits are going to be approached in the future, and yet still being able to obtain that appropriate audit evidence.
Yep, very good. Brett, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just like Jim mentioned in you teeing up the session or this question, I think we did things in a different way because we had to. And I just interacting with GAO and some of the audit challenge work we did last year, just comparing notes, because we do that in the community, that using cameras on laptops, that if there are folks at the location that we may need to do some work at, that if we can leverage the person that can go on site, that wasn't always the case, but where they could, perhaps that they could turn the cameras on in their laptops, move around, be able to see certain things. It's a little harder to work in the inventory space, but you can do it. There's still ways to do that. Even AICPA picks up that there's ways to do that. I think using cameras in other ways too, I think were pretty important. And then I kind of going back to our earlier discussion, just the video conferencing, there's some benefit to being on site in person. You can kind of maybe pick up on certain things that you wouldn't in video. You actually can pick up more in video if you really pay attention. I think it just heightened our senses to look at things in a different way. And then what I will tell you, the biggest thing that from my standpoint across the IG community, what we did more of than we ever did before is data analytics. We're looking at electronic information in a different way. We can test internal controls in a way that's effective. It gives us some sense of whether or not the program is working efficiently and effectively. The data is there. I think we relied more on the more maybe manual things that we've done in the past. We get into pandemic, we got to turn. It's almost all digital, but we reacted to that. We've got a lot of great work that we've done in the IG community. The product from pandemic response, heavy emphasis on that. So much money being pushed out for just the right reasons. We need it, but you got to make sure it's also being used properly. And I think those tools that we have, and we've had them, but using them more so, and then matching data sets together has helped us do things even more so from an oversight standpoint. And I think that strengthens our evidence and the reports that we have. We got a stronger message that we can convey.
Just if I can maybe ask you a follow-up, just to expand on that a little bit, because I know people will be very interested. So you were able to do a lot of these things because you had more time on your hand, better technology, more data, or all of the above?
I'm not sure about more time in my hands, but or collectively our hands, but the technology, we've had it. The data was out there, but what it did is it kind of put us in a position to use that capability more than we have in the past, and it works. It's always worked. I just think we've used our traditional techniques more so in the past, and it's very effective. You know, the document review, the information, the interviews that we do, all that is important. The observations but if we can actually get to it's the lifeblood of an organization, it's in its data in a more effective way, I think we can actually see more. So I think that was important in pandemic. I think we're going to do even more of that as we move forward out of pandemic. I think it's an effective way to tell whether or not programs are working.
Okay, great. Sorry, George, to keep you waiting. Your thoughts on this question on evidence?
Yeah, and I guess I'll just give one example. And as I always say, it worked in our situation, given the facts and circumstance. So it may not work in all, but historically, you know, in the state, we verify inventory. And, you know, Brett talked about, you know, traditional method is, you know, an auditor goes out and observes it. And one of the inventories, of course, to a transportation department that has a high value at year end is in the summertime is the stockpile of salt and also the expenditures and stuff. So traditionally go look at it, make sure it's there and everything. But, you know, when we weren't able to do that during the pandemic, we really kind of sat back and look, okay, what's the data telling us? And can we look at that data and make sure that, you know, management has the right control? Okay, well, they have these management division reports where one division will go and observe, you know, the safety, not only the safety of the other PDT sections safety record, but also what are the inventory they have on hand. And so we could look at that management oversight report that one division was overlooking at another. So we saw evidence of that. And then if you know anything of, we could see all their purchases for salt in the system, and then we could verify, okay, is that consistent? Were they replenishing it consistent with what the NOAA weather data was showing us for when the Commonwealth received snow? And so we could be like, okay, when it snowed more, they bought more, plain and simple. What's the valuation of that? Well, salt is a commodity. Okay, so is it consistent? As the increased price in the commodities market consistent with the price that management is paying? So we're making sure that it's truly an arm's length transaction, that they're paying the fair amount. And then the last but not least, you know, we did Google searches or to see were there any news reports of salt not being applied to the roadway. So that gave us another evidence that management had the salt on hand and was using it in operation. So what we could see in the financial records was consistent with what was happening in the weather data, happening in the commodity market, and also with the local reporters on the beat, you know, providing, you know, insights into what was happening within operations without us having to leave, you know, the comforts of our house, or in this case.
Right. No, that is very interesting. Jim, just for your last comments on evidence, any?
Yeah, we heard some great alternative procedures, both from George and Brett, and so that is exactly what we had in mind when we wrote that alert. Very
good. Thank you. There are a couple of questions that came in. We have answered the first one. The other one is, maybe I'll raise that now, about technology support. People are just wondering if your organization's technology support was there to lend a hand if and when you needed that. I can speak for GAO. I mean, I think they were tremendous. I didn't feel that we had any downtime. There were initial kind of like growing pains, I think, the early days of the pandemic, but after that, everything kind of fell into place. Anything, Brett, you and George may have to say, or Jim, you may have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, you kind of touched on it, but you know, from a technology standpoint, not just support, but increasing the bandwidth at the beginning of the pandemic was critical. That typically in an organization, on a given day, usually maybe toward like a Friday, for example, we'd have perhaps some folks on telework, but now every single day and everyone. And then that's something that's not trivial. And then just being able to increase that bandwidth and do it quickly because we needed to get back into the work that we were doing. I thought that was critically important.
Great. Okay. Okay, we're moving to topic 4, and that's on fraud. Given the outflow of funds in a quick period of time, did you modify your approach in considering fraud? Jim, to you first.
Oh, fraud. Now, fraud is a big issue here for a couple of reasons. One, we had the COVID event itself, and I think that resulted in pretty substantial federal funds going out to states and localities. And so there is an inherent risk in the sense wherever there were new programs or new procedures, that was baked into part of the consideration that you'd have to have for fraud. And then the second thing was not all the auditees were operating exactly the same as they had been previously. And so if they had to modify their internal controls because they were remote, that presented at least a risk. And so what we did in our alert was we said, think about this, think about new programs, think about new money coming in, thinking about new internal controls or revisions to old internal controls that we've dealt with over time. And that was really our focus for that.
Okay, very good. Brett, how did you handle fraud?
Yeah, so Jim nailed it. In our normal programs, we pay attention to that, obviously. And then when COVID came into place, we had CARES Act funding and then additional funding that came out. Now we've got a lot more oversight. We don't have that many more people. That probably really no additional staff necessarily. I think there was some in CARES Act, there was some capability for staff to pick up some staff, but nothing compared to the magnitude of the funding and the programs that were out there, critically important programs. So yes, we're still considering fraud. We're paying close attention to it. That the analytics thing that I mentioned before, and we've all talked about it, it helped us stay ahead of it as much as we could. It's not enough. I mean, I think oversight isn't 100%, but at least let's just focus, I think, on the highest risk. The thing that I think from a standpoint of analytics that helped us do this in a way that was effective, we want to make sure those funds are used properly and then the programs are working the way that they're intended. People are getting the benefits that they need, and then the equipment, the medical treatment, and things of that nature. What analytics can let us do, though, is focus our attention on the highest risk activities. So we come up with fraud indicators. And then just like George mentioned with the road salt example that he provided, they didn't do a statistically valid random sample necessarily. They're looking for high risk activity. I think in the COVID environment, we had to do that. There's so much out there that if we go random, that could make sense, I think, from an auditing standpoint. But I want to look at the highest risk activity, which would get into the controls, I think, in a greater fashion. Focus on the exceptions. I think that it helped us do that. I think analytics is a way to do that. And just as we talked about over the last several minutes, is that it's always been there. I think we use it more and effectively.
Okay, very good. George, any thoughts on the consideration
of fraud? I mean, what was challenging for me to communicate to my audit team, and everybody who's on my team will know I say this from time to time, was auditing to the policy and not the policy. And what I mean by that, for example, I'm responsible for making sure that Commonwealth uses the funds in an appropriate manner. And so that's really, management's not frauding the federal government. So if we are the recipient of coronavirus relief fund, we are spending those funds as if they are our own tax money. We don't all of a sudden, it's kind of like if you go out to dinner and you're a hamburger type person, but all of a sudden you learn that somebody else is picking up the bill. You're like, yeah, filet mignon all the way. Okay, so I kind of sit here and I go, yeah, we should, if we're a hamburger state, we need to make sure we stay that way and don't try to go filet mignon on the federal government's dime. But on the flip side, there's always that balance between the public policy, and I think the UI program is an excellent example of this, where there's that intent and effort from a public policy standpoint to get the funds out fast, that then allows other individuals, again, outside of the entity awarding the fund, in the Commonwealth, in my case, the state, people outside of us then trying to take advantage of the program because they've realized the public policy has shifted and changed such that an internal control no longer exists that could have prevented it. And so I guess that's one of the things in dealing with the pandemic, is trying to separate out between what what the government does and spends for itself versus the way it tries to deploy the program based on public policy so that those funds are available who are rightly entitled to it. But yet, you know, sometimes when as Brett said, when you put a lot of money out, you know, both of them have highlighted, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of funds were going out the door. And so was that, how do you bring that back to a normal, to pre-pandemic level on the amount of fraud that was occurring?
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. Jim, do you want to share any experiences on, did you modify your approach in considering fraud on your engagements?
We looked at our brainstorming sessions a little bit differently. In particular, we looked at areas where there were a lot of pressures that maybe didn't exist pre-pandemic. And so that was part of our focus. Okay,
very good. Okay, moving on to our next topic, that's topic 5. It's on internal control. The question is, to what extent did your auditees' internal controls change? And did you find yourself having to document these changes? Jim, to you first from a Yellow Book perspective.
I think from a Yellow Book perspective, we just spoke about fraud. Well, internal control is one of the ways you can mitigate the opportunities for fraud if you think about the fraud triangle. So what we really tried to highlight in our document was looking for system areas where there was lots of pressure, areas where programs had changed, areas where the internal controls probably were not functioning like they were before. And to the auditor, that all translate into risk. So once you've identified those risks from those various areas, that may require you to modify some of your procedures, but you really have to gain that understanding of the internal controls and whether they were working in the, what I'll call the COVID environment.
Okay. Great. Brett, from your perspective?
Yeah, just looking at the polling question, this is one of the top areas for really every auditor out there, audit organization, is that internal controls were probably harder to take a look at. It's in many cases, and Jim mentioned this, is that things changed. And then you probably, most agency, particularly ones in medical response, that staff were moved out of or operational areas in maybe in one function, moved into pandemic response. So it's a different set of, the process has changed. And then what that does is it changes the internal control context that you're looking at. And I think that we had to adjust to that in many ways. Those techniques that we came up with before, that we talked about before in this session, I think analytics helps, not to beat that drum too much, but it is so critically important to help us get a sense whether or not the programs are working. And what that means is, are those controls out there effective in doing the things that they need to do to ensure the programs are working and then the funds are actually being used properly.
Okay, great. George, on internal control changes and what you saw, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm one of those individuals that really likes to divide and conquer. And one of the things that was challenging was that people would view items at first blush as being, oh, well, that's a change in internal control. So for example, going from a wet signature to a digital signature. Well, really, that's just the process has changed. The control is still the supervisor reviewing and validating that that is a legitimate transaction that the government wants to participate in. And so that's the control, is the supervisor review. The wet signature or digital signature is just the evidence, the type of evidence that's left behind that says that occurred. So where sometimes auditors, may have wanted to jump and go, well, we need to have 2 different samples of 2 different internal controls. It's still the same, unless there was other factors at play, it's still the same control. It's still the same supervisor. It's just the process of documenting or providing evidence of that control being operationalized. That changed. And so we could justify within our work papers why what appeared on the surface as a change in internal control was really just a change in process.
Right. Okay. Jim, coming back to you, did you find on your audits there were changes in internal controls. And did you have to document those changes?
We did. I think that the challenge is, as many people know, you end up looking at what you wrote in the previous year and carrying some of that forward. And in a way, COVID was helpful. In the sense that it allowed you to really think about, did the controls change? George, you had a great point. Maybe the evidence changed and not the control. But I think it resulted in better discussions and realizing there were things that had been carried forward for many years that we needed to really think about.
Okay, that's great. Okay, moving on to our the next topic, that's on quality control. What changes did you make to your office's quality control procedures? Do you believe these changes will be permanent? Jim, to you first from a Yellow Book perspective.
Well, I think you're going to be hearing a lot about quality control in the coming year, because there's some potential changes in how that's considered, with more of the concept of moving to quality management. But for the alert, we did bring out the fact that there may be situations where quality control and how you approach quality control had to change. And certainly all the elements of knowing all the different parts of an audit and the responsibilities to really assess the risk and where those risks might have been changed or as a result of people working remotely and whatnot, to still allow for assuring quality. We highlighted thinking about the evidence of supervisory review and how that might be different than had been previously done.
Okay. Brett, how did your office's quality control procedures change, or they remained the same?
We use the same basic quality control processes. Certainly things changed because we weren't on site at all during the pandemic. We had many months we were in the same position, doing everything remotely. And then we use electronic work paper packages, and we have really good tools in them to get a sense of the work papers are supporting the reporting, which is what we're really trying to do, is get that message out to the action officials, and that it is based on fair and correct. Okay. Okay, so just picking up where I left off, we used electronic work papers in the past, and then when the pandemic came upon us, we continued to do that, but I think we were using more remote video technology to be able to get a sense of making sure the work is actually supporting the reporting that we do. That's our message out to action officials, to do things in a different way with our recommendations and our findings. We just want to make sure that we've got that information that makes sense. And then kind of going to Jim's point, I think maybe going to that quality management perspective, it really ties in the engaged supervision aspect of it. I think that's just how we've talked about that over the last few years. I think that's a good thing. I think we want to make sure that we've got factual information and it's correct and it's fair, but also tying in management oversight. I think we've been able to use the remote technology, the video, to help us in that regard and make sure that we have everyone's engaged, not just the managers, everyone is engaged. Okay. Okay.
Okay. George, over to you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you want me to talk about quality control within our office. Right. So one of the things that kind of happened to me, I guess I was the lucky to happen to me, was that typically our quality control, they pick out which engagements will be selected for a quality control review, at the start of the work plan year. New funding came to the state, an extra engagement was added for the audited CRF, Coronavirus Relief Fund. I was wrapping up the audit, and they all of a sudden said, well, you weren't in our original pool to be selected. And so now this is completely new, new program, new requirements, an agency that typically had never had to manage this type of federal funding before. And so now we are going to pull your audit for a quality control review, which was fine, but it just showed that things were changing so much that you couldn't just go with the status quo. You needed to be adaptive and responsive as new risks came about. And the other part is our peer review was done 100% remotely. The team was able to get access to all of our work papers, review them, do video conferences to ask questions. My personal preference would be is that they come on site again, because I think talking to peers one-on-one, after they've done the quality control review, after I looked at our work paper, we can compare notes and maybe on how, they achieved the audit standards versus how we achieved the audit standards. I just kind of look for that networking and connection that hadn't, it was kind of limited in a virtual setting. And so why it was effective peer review, I wish it could, the other parts that you get with seeing people in person, like doing conferences in the future, that networking and talking to peers outside of the classroom would really, I'm looking forward to doing that again.
Right. No, that's good, good input there. Thanks, George. Jim, going back to you on quality control, sounds like we should be on the lookout for new alerts or changes in quality control. Did I hear you correctly, or?
Well, I don't think in the context of the current Yellow Book, but I think some of the other standard setters are looking at quality control a little bit differently. And so the International Auditing Organization, the IAASB, and the USASB, which we tend to be very closely linked with, are in the process of looking at quality control. So I think we'll see a lot more of that discussion in the future.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Now we are moving on to our final topic. I think we've got about 3 minutes left, and that's on professional skepticism. With remote work being done remotely, in some cases entirely, how did that change professional skepticism, and what are the implications for the future? Jim, to you first.
I think it's just a matter of you're getting representations and then stepping back and assessing whether they make sense. And do you have corroborating evidence or information that you can use? And I think that was just highlighted, the importance of that during this COVID period.
Okay, great. Brett, hopefully your sound issue has been rectified. Are you with us, Brett?
Yeah.
Okay, on professional skepticism, I mean, how did you address that issue, especially when most of you were working remotely?
Just as Jim mentioned, so we're using remote technology. We certainly can't see people directly as we would in person, but we can still pay attention to risk indicators that would just make us just pay more attention where we need to. Is definitely harder. I think being in a room, being able to work with somebody, interacting in that manner, you can actually pick up on things that make you sensitive to that. But I can tell you that, again, moving into the analytics space, we could probably get a sense of things that we need to pay attention to in a way that we had not used as much in the past. We used it as effective, but I think even more effective when we moved into the pandemic environment.
Okay, great, thank you. George, to you, the same question.
Yeah, about professional skepticism, I'll kind of go back to one of the things that I've seen in our documentation is like the honesty in which people are able to speak, because we do broad interviews, lack of a better term, throughout our engagement, whereas our staff interact with the client, they'll ask them, are you being asked to withhold information? Are there, is there anything you'd like to bring to our attention as we do this audit? And I have to admit, it had, in knowing, and they would actually describe the nature of the conversation of what wasn't occurring in the office. It was happening over a video meet meeting, and then staff would say, talk to them in their house, about, how things were going along at work. And you kind of feel like, well, if anybody should feel comfortable speaking freely to the auditor, it would be from the comfort of their own house versus, an office where their boss is next door, directly next door. So yeah, we still practice professional skepticism, but I have to admit, when I see the documentation coming back from fraud meetings, I wish they would kind of continue in that manner, because they appear as if people would be able to speak more freely in those situations. But I agree, stepping back and looking at the audit evidence and going, okay, is what we're seeing in the audit evidence a proper representation of what is happening within operations and not misleading, is one of the key things we do. And so, yeah, even sitting back and looking at pandemic, the new federal funding, is that showing up in the financial statements the way it should? Is it showing up in our schedule of expenditures of federal awards so the federal government knows that we're spending it, or are they properly reflecting that we've passed it on to a subrecipient that we're now responsible as a state for monitoring? So yeah, still have to practice some professional skepticism.
Yep, that's very important. Well, we have run out of time. There was one very quick question, and I don't have an answer. When you speak of videos, are you talking about Team or Zoom, or is it a different medium you're talking about? Is it, I don't know, I think you mentioned videos, George.
Yeah, I know I did. I guess I was intentional not to publicize a medium, but since you asked me the question, we use Zoom for training, and for video discussions, we use Teams because it's integrated in with our communication internally. Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for being on this panel, and audience, thank you very much for participating. I hope you have a great afternoon, and please do not forget to evaluate this session. Thank you. Goodbye.